name is Hanna Järvinen. First, disclaimer. Yes, I have a PhD in history. In fact, I'm a docent in cultural history. But this is not my research topic and not my period of interest. This is a popularization. So last year, I was watching Black Sails. How many of you seen the series? Oh, pretty good. It's on HBO and Netflix. It's a prequel to Treasure Island. How many of you have heard of Treasure Island?
I've read it too.
I got my copy of Treasure Island from my granddad at the age of maybe 8, which was way too young. So there I'm sitting on a sofa and I'm yelling at the screen, going like, "You can't do that!" Holding a period map, well, near a period map. And my partner, Demos, over there, was going like, "Why don't you talk about that to our role player friends?" And then I opened my mouth at a party, and here we are. The rest is history. Well, actually, it's not history. Like I said, this is not history, it's popularization. So most of the following is based on what historians call secondary sources. That is, sources by peeps who know better because they weren't there when things went down. Whereas historians concentrate on what are called primary sources, that is, sources by people who were actually there. And the few ones that I have read or encountered are unfortunately extremely, notoriously unreliable. Such as, for example, that by Alexander Exumelin, or however you pronounce his name, a ship's doctor who sailed with Captain Morgan. Yes, that Captain Morgan. Second disclaimer, if you want to keep your romantic images of pirates sailing in tall ships and, searching for treasure or burying treasure or whatever, propagated by people like Mr. Stevenson and every pirate film and game ever, I suggest this might not be the place for you. There are no treasure maps, because there's no buried treasure, well, with the possible exception of one William Kidd, with whom we begin our tale. Third and final disclaimer, you may, of course, create whatever kind of pirate characters you want for your games. But please, when working with historical material, don't pretend to historical accuracy unless you have at least a doctoral level understanding of the specific period methodology and a few years of archival research. As a historian, sort of word of warning. However, I will not take any responsibility if somebody next decides to rig up a tall ship and sail in a pirate lot, and I know some of you are now thinking of doing exactly that. Not my fault. So let's start from the end. Piracy was, for quite some time, a capital offense. On the 23rd of May, 1701, the Scotsman William Kidd was transported from Newgate Prison in London, which stood next to the Old Bailey, which is still there, past the Tower of London, down to the execution dock at Wapping, there to hang for murder and piracy in the high seas. This was commonly known as the Long Walk and the Short Drop. The Long Walk is pretty obvious. It's a couple of miles from Newgate or Marshalsea, which was the other famous prison, to Wapping. The short drop referred to how pirates were hung by a short rope over sea, which prevented their necks from snapping so that they would choke to death slowly. There were no pardons at these hangings. At Kidd's hanging, the first rope broke. He was just strung up again, and the second one held. After execution, the body was traditionally left for 3 tides to wash over it. And particularly notorious cases like Kidd were turned into a further warning example by tarring and gibbeting their bodies, in Kidd's case, at Tilbury Point for 3 years. So violent death at sea, in both battle or brawl, or at the end of a hempen rope, was the fate of most early 18th century pirates, usually after no more than 2 or 3 years' plunder. In other words, pirate careers were short and bloody. Yet, capital punishment is a pretty extreme way for a state to regulate its citizens, most other kinds of crimes, you would suspect that the execution would actually be commuted to something less drastic, say, for example, indentured labor. But with piracy, this increasingly was not the case. In fact, there's a definite trend of stricter, harsher punishments in an effort to curtail piracy in the second and third decades of the 18th century. Between 1716 and 1726, there were approximately 400 to 600 executions for piracy in Britain and her colonies. And this, in effect, put an end to piracy by killing pirates faster than new ones arose. So from its high point in the 17-teens, by 1730, English piracy in the Caribbean was mostly eradicated. Now, public executions also speak of a very different mindset of the people at the turn of the 18th century. It's a common misperception that people in the past were just like us, except they just chose to wear funny clothes. And that's really not the case. The hardest part of a historian's job is trying to figure out why people do things, because they think in a manner completely different to us about everything. I mean, like body, sex, family, law, duty, God, universe, everything, even what was funny. And pirates are an excellent example of such epistemological problems in historiography. Most because they didn't leave anything behind. Even the most famous pirates are notoriously difficult to identify. Most came from the lowest social classes, they were illiterate and transient, and they were criminals, meaning that they actively destroyed the evidence, including changing their names. Unlike 17th century privateers, many of whom sailed private, commissioned warships, and therefore were sort of, at least in principle, in the service of the crown. Pirates were criminals who did not brag about their exploits by leaving letters or diaries for future generations. However, over the past decade or so, new research has actually worked a massive change in what can we know about pirates due to new interdisciplinary methodologies that have both focused attention on new kinds of source materials, for example, physical objects, and read existing materials against the grain, so to speak. So, performative turn in the humanities, new history, post-colonialist, queer studies, all that stuff. The stuff that I teach normally in my day job. Piracy in the Caribbean is usually roughly divided into three phases. So first, the privateer phase of the mid-17th century that gave rise to so-called Jamaica discipline. Second, the so-called pirate round of the late 17th century that connected the Caribbean with piracy on the African coast and the Pacific Ocean. And third, the beginning of the 18th century that can itself roughly be divided into two phases, so-called Pirate Republic in Nassau and the period following the War of Spanish Succession. And I'm focusing only on the last bit for reasons that I hope become evident during this talk. 4 legal documents are particular watersheds at discussing this last of the 3 phases. The 1698 law, the Treaty of Utrecht, the 1718 pardons, and the 1721 law. And the first and the last are pretty obvious. As Michel Foucault has pointed out, law creates specific subjects called criminals. In England, the Offences of Sea Act from 1536 made it very difficult to prosecute both pirates and those aiding and abetting piracy, because the piracy happened at sea and the aiding and abetting part on land. So the first was subject to maritime law and the Admiralty Court, and the latter was subject to regular civic law, or actually common law in England. And England's colonies could also pass their own laws. So certain colonies in the New World were loath to pass any law that would curtail piracy, simply because piracy, for many colonies, brought immediate economic gain. So there is a connection between land and sea that is often missed in, especially popularizations of pirate mythology. So In 1698, under increasing pressure from factions that did not benefit from piracy, King William III signed to effect an act for the more effectual suppression of piracy. And this new law essentially made it easier to prosecute for piracy. You no longer had to haul the criminals back to London for trial. So instead, you can set up an admiralty court where you could, with 3 people, without a jury, convict anyone, not only of piracy, but also the accessory part. And it also made piracy a capital offense, expanded the notion of piracy to things like serving the foreign state, which sort of curtailed privateers just going to the French and going like, and numerous other things. And similarly, the 1721 Act aimed to curtail piracy by putting a price on the head of any pirate. This sort of gave incentive to His Majesty's subjects and the Navy in particular to actually go hunt some pirates. Previously, the Navy wasn't very diligent about this. To be fair to King George I, he had first made an effort of the carrot kind, so pardoning any pirate or accessory who would voluntarily turn themselves in to a governor or representative of their majesty by 5th of September 1718. And now, because you need a stick as well, if you didn't, then you would get a price on your head. But because communications were rather slow and there was sort of a fear of a war with Spain again, the deadline, so to speak, was extended to 1st of July 1719. And nevertheless, by 1721, it was blatantly obvious that although the pardons had managed to break apart the pirate republic in Nassau, it was equally clear that most pirates who'd taken the pardon had just gone back on the account. Hence the new law. Someone helping, aiding, or otherwise involved in piracy. Sorry, academic. But anyway, this is the reason why I focus on England is not only because most of our sort of popular understanding of piracy comes from English sources, sources in England or Britain. After 1707, England becomes Great Britain, so United Kingdom. But because other countries at this time would have had a very different understanding of who counted as pirates. For example, the Spanish, because the English canon had this unfortunate tendency of firing in the presence of Spanish merchantmen. So it's for England that the Caribbean really mattered, because this had to do with the most important feature of European modernity, namely colonialism. So colonialism, simply put, is European exploitation of the rest of the world. In the New World, this meant the Spanish. Most English colonies in the Caribbean were founded by more or less piratical means, some already in the 16th century. So in 1559, England and Spain had agreed that hostilities in the areas west of the Prime Meridian and south of the Tropic of Cancer would not trigger wars in Europe, because hostilities there were sort of constant. But this left the Caribbean in the no peace beyond the line zone. And the term privateer was actually invented in the Caribbean to sort of distinguish between pirates and the sort of more legal sea marauders. Between the sort of originally between the kind of triangular trade that was happening then with numerous countries taking part, pirates, well, privateers, according to Caribbeans, benefited the plantation economy by looting slaves from competing empires and spending their plunder in port, even acting as a sort of a local defense force in some cases. But as the ratio of white men to slaves changed, so did the interests of the plantation owners, who started fearing slave revolts. And they started seeing pirates as luring away white men who could potentially quench those revolts. So with the dispersal of the trade monopolies of the Royal Africa Company, slavery, and the East India Company in the Pacific, and followed by the Treaty of Utrecht that gave the British the asiento, the right to trade 4,800 slaves to the Spanish colonies in the New World. It also became far more profitable for the Brits to secure their own triangular trade rather than attack Spanish shipping. In other words, the primary incentive for ending piracy was the slave trade. Now, what piracy was and who qualified as pirate is in practice rather vague. And privateering made this distinction even less clear. In principle, a privateer set off after he had acquired from the crown or the crown's representative a letter of marque to attack enemy merchant shipping during wartime, or a letter of reprisal, which allowed them to correct a particular personal wrong. So if a particular Frenchman attacked a Brit, or well, English back then that Englishman could seek for a letter of reprisal to attack any Frenchman for this one person's crime, and then the Frenchman that they attacked could ask for a letter of reprisal to attack any Englishman, and so on. And this letter of reprisal system was centuries old, a convoluted mess of revenge upon revenge. The letters of marque and reprisal were for specific captains, specific kind of armaments, particular purposes, and for limited time. But these conditions were usually unilaterally changed by the ship privateers, because if your venture didn't prove profitable enough, quickly enough, you just sort of had a big incentive of slightly changing something in the contract. However, any privateer exceeding the specifics of their letter, attacking an ally, or the shipping of the crown that they purportedly served, or refusing to share the loot with their investors and the crown, was committing piracy. So, however, at the same time, seamen might commit acts of piracy without identifying as a pirate. So already in the 16th century, Sir Francis Drake was outraged every time anybody called him a pirate, even though he had to know that many of his acts qualified as piracy. And piracy also had to be voluntary. So indicated by taking a share of the profit. So men who were forced on privateers or pirate ships would not be considered pirates unless they shared the loot. Certainly, whether a sea rover got convicted of piracy depended on where they attempted to sell the loot, or victual, that is, gather supplies, water, etc., or regroup. Pirated goods remained the property of the original owner. And this meant that the crown was ultimately responsible for returning it to the original owner. And as a rule of thumb, the crown colonies, where the governor was directly responsible to the monarch, were less likely to harbor pirates than were proprietary colonies or company colonies, which were the two other kinds of colonies that the English had. So a proprietary colony is something that is ruled by a governor, but the governor is appointed by lords proprietor who hold the charter on behalf of the king. Whereas a company colony is, well, it's a business enterprise, where the business enterprise also stipulates how things are done, despite the crown-appointed governor. And these two latter types were essentially for profit. So piracy was very profitable indeed, especially if you forgot that the loot belonged to somebody else. So all the notorious private havens in the Caribbean, here are some examples, and the New World in general, because it was all a bit convoluted mess, were essentially set up by the local government. In the Caribbean, the English colonies were surrounded by hostile foreign powers. Between 1600 and 1714, England was at peace for 5 years in a row. Twice, but 5 years. And as you remember, in the Caribbean, hostile acts, etc., peace beyond the line. So, by 1700, as European states vied for the riches of the New World, the crown sought more oversight over the colonies, for-profit colonies, that is, and the no peace beyond the line was sort of rapidly fraying at the edges. things were also changing in terms of the atmosphere surrounding pirates and piracy. And colonial governors still were required to muster their own defenses. Unfortunately, they lacked coin to do so. Quite literally, because England had been, this is a bullion economy, so England was basically had suffered from a monetary crisis since the 16th century. And pirates brought in Spanish silver, pieces of 8. The first international standard currency, 4.4 deflation in 250 years, it's pretty good. So unlike the often clipped or forged pounds, this was good quality silver. The primary fences for pirate loot, therefore, were silversmiths, who turned the rather recognizable Spanish coin into candelabras and chocolate pots and all sorts of other, snuff boxes and things like that. Just to give you an estimate, around 1700, there were more silversmiths than lawyers in the English New World colonies. Well, until then, pirates really rarely got into trial phase, so, why bother? The local political factions also influenced whether a colony would favor pirateers or not. A strong local assembly or a group of notables benefiting from pirate loot could simply ignore the governor sort of collude with him, as William Penn, the founder and Lord Proprietor of Pennsylvania, found to his chagrin in 1699. Upon returning from a long sojourn in London, Penn found it rather difficult to try imposing the new Piracy Act, which he had opposed, by the way, since while he was away, some pirates had bought land on the Delaware, and pirates had married into leading Quaker families, including that of his governor and attorney general, and with the help of the local sheriff, some leading Quaker notables had broken and convicted pirates out of the Philadelphia jail with only a perfunctory effort at cover-up. They made an 18-inch hole in the wall. Penn was left to explain all this to the crown, and fearing for losing his charter to the crown. So he was fearing that Pennsylvania, named after him, would be turned into a crown colony. He would lose his money-making machine, so to speak. Some local governors also directly employed pirates as a sort of a local navy. As late as 1716, Lord Archibald Hamilton, the governor of Jamaica, was deposed for setting up a pirate fleet that included the notorious Henry Jennings, one of the founders of the so-called Pirate Republic in Nassau. Now here, it's notable that since the English Civil War, all sorts of malcontents and revolutionaries had both emigrated and were sent in chains to the New World as indentured labor. So after the Act of Uniformity in 1662, also religious minorities, dissenters, nonconformist sects like Quakers, escaped to the New World. And when in 1688, the English parliamentarians overthrew the Catholic James II stood in the so-called Glorious Revolution, the New World also got its share of Jacobite sympathizers. So Lord Hamilton was certainly suspected for being a Jacobite sympathizer because his brother-in-law had been condemned as a Jacobite, and a few other members of his family as well. Now, given that Blackbeard named his famous ship Queen Anne's Revenge, after the last Stuart monarch, it was likely that some pirates did consider themselves at least sort of having Jacobite sympathizers, if not a Jacobite navy. At least on a legitimate mission against George I, who was the German prince who had inherited the crown of England by being the closest Protestant relative of Queen Anne. Another reason why distinguishing pirates from privateers is difficult is that the cultural debt that early 18th century pirate crews owed to the privateers of the mid-17th century, the so-called Brethren of the Coast, who developed what became the standard contract for sea marauding in the Caribbean, the so-called Jamaica discipline, or chasse-partie, or custom of the coast. Now, allegiances to crowns being rather more flexible before the invention of nationalism, these privateering crews could have 12 languages and people from the entire spectrum of civilized life, so from servants to highest nobility. The cousin of Charles II of England went pirateering during the Civil War. So they had to develop some sort of shared operating practices. And these in turn became the foundation of most pirate articles in the early 18th century, what in fiction is often called the pirate code. However, what distinguished these privateering operations from piracy is how they were set up. By whom? Because privateering required initial investment from interested parties, ship, armament, etc. And after acquiring a letter of marque and a ship, a privateer captain would therefore sign on crew members by announcing the enterprise, for example, in a tavern, and posting the articles, with which each member of the crew then had to sign. Well, make their mark on if they were illiterate. Unlike contemporary merchant vessels or navies, crews on the account were democracies, and captains were voted into power. This meant that a captain had to be able to sell his ideas to the crew and lead from the front or be deposed. The Jamaica discipline also included substantial disability benefits, and as everyone's lives depended on the ship reaching port, the discipline also listed punishments for cowardly or disorderly behavior, or such as drunkenness or gambling or endangering the ship. But these were at least stated clearly in the articles, and the actual punishments were usually voted upon by the crew on a case-by-case basis and with simple majority. So unlike on merchant vessels or in the Navy, where the captain was a dictator, and even a perceived slight could lead to a severe corporeal punishment, people at least who signed up at least knew what they were getting into. And most importantly, whereas merchant enterprises and navies were all alike, were notorious for uneven distribution of shares or prize money, under the Jamaica discipline, everybody had a share. Officers usually a share and a half, and captain 2 shares. Now, in comparison, in the English Navy, the captain taking the prize was entitled to 2/8 of the prize money. 3/8 were divided amongst other officers, and only 2 final 8ths were divided among the crew, with able and specialist seamen receiving larger shares than ordinary seamen, landsmen, and ship's boys. Now, if the captain had his orders directly from the Admiralty, he could even get the 1/8 meant for command. So this meant that a captain was likely to get as much as 100 or more ships' hands put together. This is an early 19th century cartoon of a sailor's prayer in which the officer scolds the sailor for cowardice before battle. And the sailor responds that he's only praying that the enemy shot be distributed in the same proportion as the prize money. Now, pirate articles seem to have followed the Jamaica discipline, but since piracy was a capital offense and the articles had to be signed by crew members, they were evidence, and that means that usually the crew tried to get rid of them if they were captured or destroy them. Now, according to the Boston Newsletter, the first newspaper in America, these were Captain Edward Lowe's articles in 1722. The first is incentive, the division of shares. Second to fifth deal with conduct. 6th and 7th are about taking care of the sick and wounded. 8th offers more incentive, namely, if you spot the first, the price of the sale of the prize gets a special compensation. And the last 2 are about sobriety during fights and not blowing up the ship, please. Unlike with the breath around the coast, however, pirates didn't have a letter of marque. And they simply elected a captain at the start of a voyage. Someone who had the respect of the crew and was seen as both brave and cunning. The captain then drew up the articles that everybody had to agree on and sign, but he only had absolute authority during battle or during the chase. The crew then elected a quartermaster to prevent the captain from misuse of his authority. So the quartermaster was the final judge in arguments. He was the one who dispensed rations and shares. He organized boarding parties. He was also usually the first person to board a prize and decide what was kept and what was discarded. And often they became captains when the crew divided into prize crews. And in addition, a ship would have a boatswain to lead landing parties and a master gunner to take care of arms and armament. All decisions, however, were made by common council, in which every man had 1 vote and a simple majority always won. And this included decisions like where to sail, what to do with captives, or punishments for breaking the articles, or punishments stipulated in the articles. This was unheard of for men of this social standing anywhere in Europe. I mean, universal male suffrage was first introduced in 1792 by revolutionary France. And it also led to the kind of social order established by pirates in Nassau on New Providence Island sometime after 1706. Now, Nassau was kind of a legend among pirates because it was where on April 1st, 1696, Henry Avery, spelled with an E or an A, made landfall. After he had looted the ships of the Grand Mogul of India and the Red Sea. He was already hugely famous because he wrote a ballad about himself. That was widely distributed. Avery bought off the governor, Nicholas Trott, and dispersed his crew and sailed to Ireland, where he promptly disappeared with his share of the profits and his wife. At least £1,000, which was more than a Navy sailor would make in a lifetime, and a gentleman in a year, or a peer of the realm in about a month. These late 17th century Red Sea pirates, like Avery, also openly settled in England's New World colonies, revealing to the crown the extent to which the colonies harbored pirates. But between 1700 and 1706, Nassau had suffered repeated attacks by the Spanish in collusion with the French, and most of the settlers, including the governor, fled after the 1703 attack, and pirates took over. After beating off the competition, so to speak, the pirates settled in, and they were led by two bitter rivals, Benjamin Hornigold and Henry Jennings. And they needed to set up a government. So they emulated the ship's articles, and they voted Edward Teach, or Tatch, aka Blackbeard, as their magistrate, whose job was to enforce law and order. And this pirate republic quickly became notorious. And the arrival of the new governor, Woodes Rogers, in 1718, which is 12 years later, it was estimated that over 1,000 pirates resided in Nassau. And this is at a time when the entire British Royal Navy is 20,000 men, approximately. Rogers was the man behind the King's Pardons of 1717, and he thought to eradicate piracy, you needed simply to turn pirates into useful citizens. He would know he was a former privateer. Benjamin Hornigold famously took the pardon and began hunting his former comrades for the prize money. And Jennings took the pardon and is not heard of since. And Blackbeard wondered about it for a little bit, then took his pardon from the governor of North Carolina, one of these private enterprises, Charles Eden, which sort of promptly provoked the governor of Virginia, a crown colony, Alexander Spotswood, to go after him. Which resulted in Blackbeard's famous last fight with Captain Maynard on HMS Pearl in November 1718, in which Blackbeard lost his head, quite literally. For the most part, the pardons managed to break apart the community on Nassau without actually curtailing piracy, since so many of the pardoned men simply went back on the account. I mean, sailing a pirate ship was pretty easy because you had all these men who would do the job, and, like it was a community and easy money if you, caught a prize, and, doing manual labor on land was difficult. Now, however, as a joke, I wanted to start by stressing the difference between early 18th century pirates and earlier privateers or buccaneers, because unlike the privateers, most early 18th century pirates came from the lower social orders and had started off as common seamen. So unlike the brethren on the coast, they already shared a culture. Sailing was physically demanding, 24/7 job, where sort of frantic action followed long periods of idleness. And for the ship's hands, long voyages, which could take years at this time, meant cramped, stinking, disease-ridden conditions for months on end, foul air from smoke from candles and tobacco, and mold and mildew and vapors from the waste in the bilges, and hydrogen carbonic acid gases from the ventilation systems. And the only washing you did was with seawater, so you can imagine the stench. And there were rats, insects, and constant damp. And after the initial perishables were eaten, ship food was absolutely horrible. It was ship's biscuit or hardtack, which was aptly named because it had to be softened with liquid before it could be eaten. And salted pork, which had to be boiled before it could be eaten. Stagnant and spoiled water that was rationed out because it was in limited supply. And a daily dose of 2 gills of rum, so 284 milliliters of hard liquor. Any hard spirit or hard liquor could be called rum. And this diet meant that scurvy set in after about a couple of months at sea. Nobody knew why. Ship's officers sort of avoided it because they had their private shares and had a penchant for marmalade. And some really sort of diligent young ship's doctors did invent sort of the cure for it, lemon juice, in 1753, but it wasn't implemented until 1795. So that's British Navy for you. No man also volunteered. So few men volunteered for this kind of work. The Navy pressed men. So Britain had conscription Navy in press service since the mid-17th century. And usually, unlike in fiction, they only pressed men from ships. So merchant ships entering or leaving port, fishermen, etc. Because they wanted able-bodied seamen with usually, as much seafaring ability as possible. Now, you didn't get paid unless you reached port. So, and the Navy was constantly in arrears with pay, sometimes by 2 years. Ship discipline was strict, as noted. Justice seemed arbitrary. Rum meant that the hands were usually drunk or hung over. Extra provisions or damaged gear were reduced from wages, and seamen were also regularly cheated of their wages by corrupt officers, or being pressed before reaching port. And the cramped conditions and shared hardship meant that these seamen developed a tight-knit international community that also informed the culture of pirates. So sailors' culture had its own foul language. It was usually very foul. Songs and dances and rituals and humor. And they tended towards collectivism and anti-authoritarianism and egalitarianism. On land, sailors walked with a swagger, as accustomed as they were to the motion of the ship, sort of wide-legged, bowler stands, known as sea legs. And their vernacular was indecipherable, to landsmen, sort of a secret language. Although it had developed from the need to give concise, clear, and specific instructions very quickly to avoid and deal with the perils of the sea. So due to their profession, sailors would also know particular crafts like needlework and knotwork. But they usually didn't know how to swim, or let alone dive. Because if you fell off a sailing ship, the ship doesn't really stop or turn very easily. So, and even if your captain cared enough to drop a boat or a dinghy to try to fetch you, it was usually too late by the time, if they found you, by the time that they found you. So, how did pirates speak? We don't really know, since 18th century sources don't print swear words. But we do know that they cursed a lot, to the extent that even people accustomed to swearing seamen found pirate language foul. But most expressions that we associate with pirates derive from 19th century fiction, early 20th century stage plays. So ar is West Country for yes. Yar means something is fine or done well, as in yar in the hell. Yo-ho or yo-hope were pacing shouts, only used when hauling at the rigging or heaving at the capstan. And it's never yo-ho-ho because it's a pacing shout. Finish.
Part of the ship.
Sorry. I'm not very familiar with ships here. Now, a round shot can shiver a timber, so it can punch a hole through the ship's hull, but shiver me timbers is 19th century fiction. A captain can shout, "My heart!" There's evidence of this from 18th century short stories when a captain is encouraging the crew to fight as his heart beats. But me heart is Tom Sawyer at Huckleberry Finn playing pirates. So if pirates were like seamen, what did they look like? Well, certainly not like this. We have Howard Pyle to thank for this, for early 20th century. He's the guy most responsible for the popular culture imagery of pirates. Now, apart from the mascara, pirates carry handkerchiefs around their necks, but so they don't wear kerchief and hat. There's no point. The handkerchief was a handy item. It's a bit of color and way to show you can dye an art, but it was worn tightly around the neck. At least until the 1770s. Although seamen did not wear stocks or cravats, the name of the bit that gentlemen wore around their necks, they definitely would have kept their shirts closed at the neck. As for the dreadlocks, seriously, even if Johnny Depp is in brownface, sailors kept their hair short, or on a single tarred queue if they were Frenchmen. Becomes more popular with English seamen in the second half of the 18th century. Because it's windy in the rigging, and loose hair can get in the way or get caught or tear off a bit of your scalp.
Didn't Blackbeard supposedly have dreadlocks?
No. I'm getting to that shortly. No, that's completely untrue. You're thinking of his beard in dreadlocks. He wore his hair short. Everybody did. And most importantly, sorry?
I was going to ask, did the officers have long hair?
I have a next slide for that.
Okay.
No, they didn't. Boots. 17th century riding boots on a boat? You don't generally ride horses on ships. Or wear army boots, which you sometimes also see, because you don't clamber through mud on a ship. Sailors wore light shoes or went barefoot. Boots are utterly impractical for climbing the rigging, even walking on deck. And same with the sash, not practical. Aboard the ship, functionality was the key, not trying to look dashing. That's what you did when you went offshore. Pirates did plunder items of clothing, and many articles designated that those who had boarded the ship the prize were guaranteed a shift of clothes. But they only dressed up to go ashore to show off their wealth and plunder. And this is also when, if ever, they would have donned jewelry. So necklaces, rings, earrings, which were a gentlemanly affectation at this time. Practically the only part of Jack Sparrow's costume that is correct are the trousers, because only slaves, seamen, and middling tradesmen wore trousers. Everybody else who could afford them wore breeches with hose. So the trousers are incongruous with the rest of the outfit. If he would have gone ashore, he would have worn breeches with hose. Pirates, like sailors, were not pretty. Most who had sailed on long voyages had suffered from scurvy, which left the skin pale, with sunken eyes and loss of teeth. Shipboard accident could leave them with missing digits, even missing limbs. And pirates did not spot eye patches, unless they actually had lost an eye. And many pirate pictures that show people with eye patches are actually retired sailors, and they're retired because they have amputated limbs and they can't work on a ship anymore. Loss of depth perception on a thing that yaws and heaves and rolls, not good. So you could lose an eye in any dangerous profession. I almost included a picture of this lovely Spanish gentlewoman from the 17th century wearing an eye patch. So pirates didn't try to look the part. And they did not sail flying the Jolly Roger, or even their variation of a black flag. On the contrary, it was crucial that pirate looks as inconspicuous as possible, because the most common pirate tactic was to appear to look like a small merchant vessel, just sailing close to ask for news, and preferably you were boarding the ship, the prize, before they noticed that you were pirates. They did raise the Jolly Roger if they wanted to intimidate the prey, but that depended on the situation. Usually, the first tactic was trying not to look like pirate. So no pirate dress, and although there were quite a lot of different kind of pirate flags based on written accounts, illustrations of pirate flags are by people who never saw any in real life. In other words, period illustrations such as this one from Captain Johnson's A General History of the Pirates are not photographs of actual events, they are representations, and you need to know how to read them, to use them as sources. As you can see, it shows Roberts' two versions of the Jolly Roger. First one he only used before 1720, and the other one after 1720, so he certainly would not have flown them simultaneously. And similarly, he's dressed up as an officer. And the illustration is by somebody who never saw him. So, yes?
I'd like to ask, I've heard some rumors that in the Latimer Roberts' first flag he had, well, in the first flag he doesn't show in this image, but he's standing on two schools, but I've seen some...
No, that's the second flag. That's the second flag.
Oh, it's...
The first one showed him with an anatomy, so a skeleton, with devil's horns, and they are holding an hourglass. And the second one shows him on top of two skulls, because he got really pissed off by two particular colonies on every other. So I
remember the rumor. But I also want to ask, was it really that in the flag he had the letters of his enemies in the flag? Because I've seen versions with those letters, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, they are references to particular islanders, to specific colonies. Yeah. Well, according to legend, like most of these stories come from Captain Johnson, anonymous. No, there's no real Captain Johnson. Anonymous source from secondary source from the early 18th century, aimed at selling as many copies as possible. Also, our image of pirate hunters tends to be historically inaccurate. So gentlemen too cut their hair short because gentlemen would always wear a wig, not their own hair. Because the wigs were status symbols. And for the same reason, you would always wear a hat on top of the wig. Out of doors. Indoors, you would carry the hat under the arm, which is one of the reasons why the cocked hat, later called tricorn, became so popular. It's easier to hold under the arm than one with a round brim. So especially for somebody who's supposedly the governor of the new colony, you would definitely wear a wig and a hat outside, regardless of the heat. What's correct in his dress, which is of course made by whoever designed clothes for this TV series, he has a stock around his neck. The vest collar and breeches are sort of traditional gentleman's attire, although his cuffs are not showing. And theirs are usually made of wool. Now, we have this absurd notion that wool is very hot to wear, but actually very fine quality wool like flannelette is quite light. And most importantly, it's a self-cleaning fabric, so which is very handy when you are traveling in conditions where washing your clothes is not really an option. Now, shirts and other kinds of underwear was usually linen. Silk at this time is only for aristocrats because it had to be imported from China at ridiculous expense. Calico was imported from India. Cotton only becomes a cheap fabric with slave labor and industrialization at the second half, or towards the end of the 18th century. And pirates also supplied these really lovely materials, especially the Red Sea pirates of the late 17th century, to the colonists in the New World at very cheap prices in comparison to the monopolies of the East India Company. So yet another reason why pirates were popular. Captain Hume here is also wearing the wrong dress. He's not only in a wrong period wig, but he's wearing a uniform, and British Navy officers didn't have uniforms until 1748. And even then, there were no rank insignia. This uniform is in the 1770s style, and as is the powdered periwig. Periwigs only become fashionable in the mid-1730s with the boy king of France, Louis XV, because they were boyish forms of wig. Now, British soldiers and Marines did wear uniforms. Marines kept apart from sailors as they were there to keep the sailors from mutiny. But even Marines wore the distinctive red uniforms only for watch, action, and guard duty. Not only because the bloody thing stained easily, but because for shipboard duty, uniform is not very comfortable. So they wore the regular slops that sailors wore. Incidentally, the Marine uniform is red because red was the cheapest color of wool, not because it would not show bloodstains. It actually does stain quite easily. What of gender? These days, every pirate flick has a woman pirate. Now, in reality, out of those hundreds who hung in the early part of this, the 18th century, there were 4 women pirates ever condemned. 2 of them, however, are quite notorious. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, captured with Calico Jack Rackham's crew in 1720. And they famously escaped immediate hanging by pleading their bellies. That is, they claimed that they were pregnant. Now, Mary Read died in prison of a fever, and the fate of Anne Bonny is unknown. In addition to Mary Read and Anne Bonny, there are only 2 cases of women tried for piracy in the English New World. Both are from Virginia. Mary Harley, or Harvey, in 1726, and Mary Cricket, or Critchett, in 1728. The former was released, and the latter hung. So why the popularity of women pirates? Now, fiction reflects our current values and project them to any subject matter. If there weren't women, we would sort of feel not comfortable with the narratives. In the early 18th century, however, gender was tied to class, property, profession, and dress, as well as corporal difference and gender-stipulated behavior, including things like your vices. A poor woman, if you needed to become a man, it was pretty easy. You just donned a man's dress, adopted a man's name, and took the king's shilling, and that's it. And similarly, a man could choose to live as a molly. Now, the passing was not easy, and the social sanctions, especially towards men, were really harsh, although based on a completely different logic than today. However, recent research has revealed that there were far more people who did cross-dress or change gender than previously thought. Of course, some women also just wanted adventure and a say in matters. But dress created gender without a relationship to any kind of understanding of the self. So you don't need to have a sort of a trans identity to change genders at this point in time, which is not to say that some people would not have felt that they were born in the wrong kind of body, but it's a mistake to project our understanding of their motives or their self onto these past individuals based on superficial similarity, because our reasoning is so different from that of the 18th century people. And unfortunately, we have very few accounts by people who chose to swap genders, simply because most of them came from the lower classes and were illiterate. Now, sailing was highly gender segregated, overwhelmingly male working environment, and it seems to have been a belief amongst sailors that the sea required a degree of suppression of sexual desires. However, there is no evidence really of any kind of superstition against women in board until the 19th century. Rather, gender imbalance had to do with how sailing skills were learned, as well as women's physique and dress. So only 2 pirate articles that remain even mention women. Bartholomew Roberts' 1720 articles forbade both women and boys aboard, and John Phillips's outlawed meddling with any prudent woman without her consent, which is not to say that pirates wouldn't rape captives, they did. What these articles show is the exclusion of anything that might cause division or fights amongst crew members. For example, gambling was almost always forbidden or restricted in pirate articles. Now, unlike women soldiers, Reed had been a woman soldier before she became a woman pirate. But neither Bonny nor Reed cross-dressed tried to pass for men aboard. They only cross-dressed for battle because it's bloody inconvenient to jump over gunwales in a skirt. Women associated with pirates tended to remain ashore as wives or mistresses, aiding and abetting, fencing and victualling pirates, as with Mary Harley and Mary Cricket both. If society was sort of not outright making them victims of pirates in various ways, nevertheless, you have to remember that 18th century society was very patriarchal. Only unmarried and widowed women could own property and sign contracts, for example. And marriage was very much about family ties and property, not love and desire, which is why there is so much adultery, as we know from all the sermons that preach against it. Divorce allowing remarriage required an act of parliament, which meant restricted it to the peers of the realm, basically. It's prohibitively expensive. Now, contemporary belief in humoral pathology explained that people in the tropics had more sexual urges. So in the Caribbean, there were very few white women, so the Caribbean colonies did not pass any restrictions against mixed marriages or mixed relations, in stark contrast with England's mainland colonies. This created a rich variety of different kinds of brown skin color and hierarchies of discrimination. And until attitudes began to change towards the end of the 18th century and the invention of scientific racism, Englishmen tended to send their brown children back to England because there they faced better educational opportunities and less discrimination than in the Caribbean. Now, for example, in the Caribbean, a free woman of color would have had a choice of becoming somebody's mistress, a healer, or an innkeeper, usually meaning a brothel keeper, whereas most prostitutes were slaves, so owned by the innkeeper. What of pirate vices then? As the saying goes, sailors had 3 vices: rum, bum, and bacca. Rum is self-evident. Getting drunk increased the risk of accidents and negligence and brawls, and pirates were even more liberal with alcohol than privateer crews. And there are stories of privateer crews that repeatedly try to take a prize, but they're too drunk to manage it. Pirate crews tended to land so as to, they tended to be large so as to offset attrition from battle, disease, and prize crews, because when you took another vessel, you needed people to sail it. And this meant that there was less to do per person, so fewer free riders, because there were almost no officers. So in comparison to merchant service and navy, pirates had it relatively easy. They also had better food and rum. Tobacco was considered healthy, but lighting it was dangerous. Now, anything that burns might burn the ship, because you're essentially sailing a tarred tinderbox loaded with accelerants and explosives. So for the same reason, most pirate articles forbade open fire and snapping of the guns in the hold where the gunpowder was held. And sodomy, well, long voyages and no women on board. Now, like piracy, sodomy was a capital offense, punishable by hanging. Yet, based on contemporary evidence, it was rather more common and rarely prosecuted. Sodomy is not homosexuality, because it was an act, not an identity. It was your choice, and you did not define yourself through the act. You might repeat, but that's your preference. And in the 19th century understanding of homosexuality, homosexuality is an identity. Your sense of self is tied to your sexuality. Sexuality wasn't invented until the 19th century. Although in England, sodomy charges do spike between 1710 and 1730, thanks to this moral reform movement following the Restoration, and thief takers curtailing molly houses, which were these places where men could seek sex with other men. In stark contrast to the trials of the 19th century, all of the men condemned of sodomy in 18th century England were of the lower social classes. Now, in the Navy, ship's doctors' accounts attest that sodomy was far more common than trial evidence suggests. In fact, too common to be punished, especially at sea. You still needed to sail the ship. Until well into the 19th century, charges were usually brought only to curtail fraternization between men of different standing in the Navy ship's hierarchy, or when command or social hierarchy was threatened, as in the case of potential mutiny. And again, based on contemporary accounts, this was also the case with privateers. Although of late, some popular authors have made much of matelotage amongst the brethren on the coast. So matelotage is a relationship of shared property and mutual obligation between two men who shared the same berth, but different watches. So in other words, they were sharing the same hammock when the other person was not there. And some of these relationships may have had more to them, but since sodomy was criminal, you didn't really write that down. So there's no evidence either way. With pirates, there's some trial evidence about same-sex desires voiced by pirates, and certainly sermons preaching against the abominable sin of uncleanliness of pirates, but only Bartholomew Roberts' articles explicitly forbid both women and boys. But Roberts was rather straight-laced for a pirate. He was also the only pirate whose articles forbade musicians from playing on the Sabbath, which brings me to religion. Sailors tended to mark their religion by tattoos, which of course were not called tattoos at this time, not until the European so-called discovery of Tahiti in the 1760s. So you pricked or marked or stained your skin with black marks or gunpowder spots or pictures made of India ink and gunpowder. And there are some hilarious contemporary stories of people trying to remove tattoos. The functional purpose of tattoos was that you wanted to be buried according to particular rites, and you better get it on your skin. That's usually all you have. Usually hands or arms to convey the message to those left behind with your body. But tattoos were also used for decorative purposes, even on the face. Although pirate articles were influenced by Protestant idols, little is known of pirates' attitudes to religion beyond accounts of confession of condemned pirates. And here it's notable that it was customary for those sentenced to death to repent and reform and beg for God's mercy, if only in the hopes of absolution or lenience from the court. This expected expression of repentance was why the condemned man was given the last words. But starting from around 1704, many pirates used the opportunity to toast to damnation to those who had captured them or wronged them and or praise their merry lives, which sort of didn't go according to script. Unsurprisingly, pirates did have a sense of humor. The name used of any pirate flag, the Jolly Roger, may be either a reference to the devil or a play on to Roger, that is, to fuck. Pirates entertained themselves by music and dancing. There are accounts of this. And at least in 1722, one crew enacted a mock court of judicature to try another for piracy, in which one played a judge, others were attorneys, guards, and prisoners brought in for a hanging. Trials of pirates sometimes also show pirates mocking the court and playing the audience, and they certainly did use their last words, for example, to speak against their captors, sometimes to roars of laughter from the audience. And all of this contributed to the popular myth of pirates as kind of folk heroes, as well as to the gradual removal of hangings from public spaces to prison courtyards. Again, like sailors, pirates also had exotic pets. Some clearly were meant to be sold as part of the loot. Parrots, exotic birds, were particularly common, and monkeys. Cats were common on ships because they kept the rodent population at bay, but goats or pigs, for example, were there for food. Now, in one sense, Black Sails reflects Caribbean piracy better than most pirate fiction because it has brown and black characters, including pirates. And it's true that most notorious Caribbean pirates are white men. But there are obvious reasons why. First, the status of white men. as a white man, you were obviously free and more trustworthy in a slave society. And second, piracy involved mostly white men who could sail European ships and spoke European languages. Black pirates were usually not slaves freed by pirates. They tended to be either free blacks or descendants of escaped slaves, which are called maroons. Pirates liked capturing slavers. Both the White Dog Alley and Queen Anne's Revenge had been slave ships, but not because they wanted to free the slaves, they wanted to sell them. Slavers were notoriously easy to capture because they had disgruntled crews. The slave ships had horrible enterprises. But unfortunately, slaves become a difficult kind of property because not only did you have to feed them, but they become increasingly difficult to fence after the Treaty of Utrecht. So pirates started off killing slaves. Maroons, however, built inland to avoid capture. So that made them landsmen, and the only landsmen that pirates had any use for were people with useful skills like carpenters or surgeons. Given the countenances of the Caribbean population, however, and the difficulty of deciphering the genealogies of even the most famous pirates, it's quite impossible to tell how many people of color there were in pirate crews, and how many of those were freemen, and how many were slaves. Contemporary sources clearly exaggerate the number of non-white pirates as this pandered on the fear of slave revolts, and therefore sold the accounts that told these stories. Having said this, when Blackbeard wrecked Queen Anne's Revenge in 1718, half of the 100 crew that he took with him were black. So not all pirates were white, although most non-white pirates were Spaniards in the 1730s and 1740s. However, the pirate dress in black sails is still as incorrect as anything. They're all open collars, no kerchiefs. Only one fellow here is wearing the kind of hat, the little cap here, that were very popular with sailors. It's windy on a ship. And then there's the pirate ship's wheel. Ships didn't have wheels until around 1715. The teller was a horizontal bar attached to the rudder. And most vessels, regardless of size, had those kinds of tillers until way into the 18th century, especially with pirate ships, because by and large Caribbean pilots did not sail tall ships. Technically, a ship, by the way, is anything with 3 masts, and a tall ship is something with top gallants. Top sails, at least. But let's just say ship for any vessel. As a pirate, what you would want of a ship as a fast, clean, light, stiff, and weatherly. Okay, so fast is obvious. You want something that can chase faster than your prey is escaping, and you also want something that's fast enough to run away if necessary. Light means it has low draught, and this is very important. However, a light ship cannot carry very heavy loads, such as cannon, or take much fire. Clean meant fine lines, so any ornamentation like high forecastle or quarterdeck slows the ship down, and pirates often rasped ships, so eliminated extra ornamentation, forecastles, quarterdecks, etc. Now, however, fewer decks meant fewer guns, especially given the need for hold space for the loot. Now, stiff means a ship that is steady in the water, so less yawing, heaving, and rolling on a cranky ship. Weatherly means making little leeway when the ship is close-hauled, so something that allows you to sail close to the wind without drifting off your course. Although always seen in pirate fiction, tall ships like this simply did not fulfill these conditions. This is a kind of rigging that is really good on long voyages, not for skulking prey. It's bad at moving against the wind, and the bigger the ship, the faster its hull speed. But a lighter ship can pick that speed up much faster than a big ship like this, and they can also turn on a proverbial dime. Or as Admiral Edward Vernon once remarked, sending a navy ship after a pirate vessel was sending a cow after a hare. More importantly, the bigger the ship, the heavier, and the lower it rides in the water, and the Caribbean has shallow waters. Which is why I was shouting at back sails. This is the map of New Providence Island. It's undated, but it can be deduced to be from the 1740s because of the information it has. It's land owned by Woodes Rogers, who was governor between 1718, 1721, and then 1728 to 1732. It's also upside down. South is up. And on the north side, there are two forts. The British didn't start the building of Fort Montague until 1741. It also shows the governor's house, built in 1737. There's a deep water channel marked on the west side. Sorry, the west side of the map over there. But the entrance to the harbor gives low tide mark of 14 feet. The other end of the harbor is 11 feet. In comparison to other pirate havens, however, this was pretty good. In another American way of cooking fish and